here we go. So welcome, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Uri Schreter. He is an interdisciplinary musicologist, composer, keyboardist, and filmmaker. He is currently pursuing a PhD in historical musicology at Harvard University, where he researches Jewish music during the early post-war period. Prior to Harvard, he studied at Tel Aviv University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in composition and musicology and a master's degree in modern European history. His scholarship has been supported by the American Musicological Society, I'll get it out, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And we are thrilled that he agreed to join us this evening. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight him for everyone and go ahead and turn it over. It's all yours, sir. Take it away.
Thank you. Let me just start by sharing my screen. Can you all see this well now? Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan, and especially to Hillary for the invitation to speak here today, and for the opportunity to just to share my work with all of you in Michigan or wherever it is that you're watching this from. As I hope you'll see in a moment, I'm pretty excited about all of this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions or anything you'd like to share with me. So today I'm going to talk about Jewish wedding music and American Jewish identity in the early post-war period, so around the 1950s, more or less. And I want to show you just how important this music was for American Jews, what it meant for them, and the intensity of emotions that it could evoke, complicated, diverse emotions that reflected the diversity of American Jews and of the cultural changes they were going through during this era. And right off the bat, I want to start us off with a couple of anecdotes that demonstrate this emotional intensity that people felt about Jewish wedding music. And the first story comes from Chaim Ehrenreich, who was a journalist for the Forwards, and he attended a Jewish wedding and wrote about it for the paper. This was in 1957. This was a Reform Jewish wedding where the band played absolutely no Jewish music, which was actually pretty rare, as I'll show you later. And this is what he said. The Reform chuppah, this is the wedding canopy, ended with a wedding dinner, not kosher, not even kosher style, and with dances, not even a single Jewish dance, no hopke, beugestanz, sher, kadril, redlich, or polka. The band, in scare quotes, of course, played only waltzes and jazz music. It was one of the coldest weddings I have ever had the occasion to attend. Everything was pretentious, restrained, aesthetic, but with such coldness that I never would have believed that a Jewish wedding can be so tasteless, so utterly worthless. It's been 3 months already since the wedding, and I still feel a chill in my heart when I think of it. Those are pretty harsh words. The second story I want to share with you, which shows us a very different perspective, comes from one of the musicians I've interviewed for this project. This is Marty Silverstein, who was a pianist, band leader, and contractor in the Jewish wedding music industry for over 50 years. And Marty told me about a very unusual incident at a wedding. And this is from a bit later, it's the 1970s, but I'm still including it here because it's such a powerful story. So before the wedding, when he met with the families, the bride made it very clear that there should be no Jewish music at her wedding under any circumstances. She was strictly against it. But then during the wedding itself, some people from the groom's side came up to the bandstand and begged Marty to play a hora. They said they wanted to feel some Yiddishkeit. So Marty said, listen, I'm very sorry. And he explained the situation to them. He said why basically he can't play a hora. But then these guests called over the bride's father to discuss this matter, and they tried to persuade him. And eventually the father said to Marty, you know what, just give them what they want, play some Jewish music. Essentially, he was dismissing his daughter's wishes. So then the band starts to play a hora, the crowd goes wild, and everyone is dancing. But the daughter, the bride, she sees what's happening, and she's furious, and she's cursing, and she punches her fist straight through the wedding cake. So I brought you these stories just as a teaser to show you that Jewish wedding music can be beautiful, it can be fun, but for some people it can be a lot more than that, and it can reflect something very deep about how people perceived themselves as Jews and as Americans, especially during this period, the cultural transformations of the early post-war period. So in this lecture, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of Jewish wedding music during this era, including the different kinds of music they played and the different communities of American Jews that were the main audience for this music. But the main thing I'm after today is to try and understand people's experience with this music. I want to show you, first of all, what it was like to be a Jewish wedding musician in the 1950s, what kind of life you had, and also what this music meant to the people who were listening and dancing to it at their own weddings. And as I'll show you, Jewish wedding music became a lot more important during this period because it was a secular symbol of continuity with Jewish tradition. And so for many American Jews, especially the less observant Jews, it came to stand in for Jewishness as a whole and became one of the main ways for them to express their Jewish identity. In this specific talk, I'm going to focus primarily on Ashkenazi Jewish weddings in New York, because that's where I did most of my research and especially most of my interviews that you're going to hear today. But I also wanted to try and relate this to you today in Michigan and make this hopefully a little more interesting for you. So I did some research in the digital archives of Detroit Jewish News at the University of Michigan, and I was able to find some interesting pieces about Jewish wedding music in Detroit that you'll see later on. And I also want to say that while New York doesn't necessarily represent the American Jewish experience as a whole, there were often a lot of similarities. So some of you might identify with some of the things I say, or you might recognize them in your parents or your grandparents. And regardless whether this is somewhat similar or very different, I'd love to hear about your own experiences in the end. So please stick around for the Q&A. And just to give you an outline of what I'll talk about today, I'm going to start by describing the club date business. This is the Jewish wedding music scene and the industry around it. Then I'll give a very brief survey of the musical repertoire, the different kinds of music that were played at these weddings. Then I'll discuss the American Jewish spectrum. These are the diverse communities of American Jews in post-war New York. And I'll explain a bit about this diversity, how it related to the different musical repertoires. And finally, I'll show you how this music served as an expression of American Jewish identity. And we'll have some time for questions and comments in the end. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about the club date business. This is the name that musicians, especially in New York, they use for still today for the industry of live music bands for any kind of event. And this means weddings, bar mitzvahs, and banquets, but also meetings of social organizations, political parties, business conferences, you name it. This included Jewish events, but there were also other sectors of this industry. There were other ethnic sectors like Polish, Italian, or Greek, and also just a general unmarked Christian American market. Musicians in New York, generally speaking, worked across the industry in all the sectors and all the different kinds of events. This was also true for Jewish musicians, who usually got most of their paychecks from playing Jewish weddings and bar mitzvahs, but they certainly worked for other populations, and some of them even specialized in it. The club date business started to emerge in the first decades of the 20th century, and by the early post-war period, it was already a well-established industry with mechanisms and institutions that governed the everyday lives of musicians and also influenced the music they played. The musicians themselves were essentially freelancers for hire, who would work these jobs or club dates, as they called them, several times a week, sometimes even 2 jobs per day on a weekend. And each job was different. It could be a different band, a different clientele, or maybe a different kind of event that each required their own special repertoire. And the musicians were expected to be skilled and flexible and to be able to play in all of these different situations, everything that you see on the screen right now. To coordinate these jobs and assemble bands from all of these individual freelance musicians, there was a whole industry of band leaders and contractors and offices who would get leads, as they called them, or requests for bookings, usually from families, synagogues, organizations, whatever it was, and then they would hire the services of individual musicians for these events. On top of that, there was also a complicated system of, let's call it, collaboration between band leaders and caterers or catering halls, where they would kind of scratch each other's backs, provide leads and sometimes exclusivity for bands in exchange for a cut of the profit. And this was sometimes legitimate, other times half legitimate or not at all. But this was how a lot of the business was done, and how musicians got to play for the people who wanted live music for their events. And I know about these collaborations primarily from New York City, Philadelphia, and some other cities on the East Coast, but I noticed as I was looking through old Jewish newspapers from Michigan that just like everywhere else, bands and caterers for weddings tended to advertise right next to each other, which isn't very surprising if you think of their clients. So here you can see ads for the orchestra of Lee Fields and Ellen's catering service, which I'll come back to a bit later. And I don't know for sure, but I can make an educated guess that bands and caterers in Detroit also work with each other, just like in all the other major cities that I know about in America. Musicians in the club date business could find work by posting ads in the papers like this, or by getting recommended by a caterer or a synagogue, or simply through word of mouth. And eventually, if they had a good reputation, work would come to them. The contractors would call and book their services. But at the same time, New York musicians, like musicians in many other big cities around the world, also had a designated place that they could go to find work. In New York, this place was called the Exchange Floor, and it was the beating heart of the industry in New York City. It was a place where musicians could come to socialize, develop connections with band leaders and contractors, buy sheet music, and hopefully fill up their calendars or their date books with jobs for the next few weeks or months. The main exchange floor during this period was operated by the Musicians Union of New York City, Local 802. I was trying to find if there was something similar in Detroit. I couldn't find the evidence right now, but there must have been something, I'm guessing. Anyway, the exchange floor for New York was located in what's called the Roseland Ballroom on 52nd Street. This was literally a dance ballroom. That's what the space was used for. But a couple of days a week on designated hours, they covered the hardwood floors, and hundreds of musicians from New York would come to hang out for a few hours. It was a huge hall with high ceilings. It was filled with smoke, and you had music professionals from every niche of the club date business spread out around the hall. So there was a corner for Jewish music, another area for Greek and Polish, some section in the back for society orchestras, and everyone was mixing and mingling together. This was especially important for young musicians who were just starting out, because this was an opportunity to meet everyone and maybe find some work. If they didn't know anyone at all, their chances were pretty slim. But if they came down to the floor in just the right time during high season, so around now, June, July, when all the other musicians were busy, then maybe they could catch a break. And here's what I heard about it from Ray Cohen, who was known as the dean of club date pianists. And he played with basically everyone, including 5 years with Frank Sinatra. But he first started out in the club date business on the Union Exchange floor. And this is what he said. I graduated high school in 1955. I joined the Union, I think, in 1956. And on the Union floor, you meet people. And at the busy time of year, like June, when it was really busy, the contractors didn't have enough musicians to cover all the jobs that were available and requiring live music. And that's the time when they would step out of their comfort zone and have to hire young guys who maybe somebody said, hey, try Ray Cohen, try Joe Blow. He knows a lot of tunes and you can't go too wrong with him. Somebody took a chance with you. And if you make something of that chance, he would say, you know, Ray Cohen did a nice job for me. And musicians talk to each other. The Union and the Exchange Floor were a big part of the lives of club date musicians. And there's a complicated history of labor struggles there that I'm not going to get into right now. But I do want to show you this document, which is the only one I was able to find so far. This is a receipt for a job by Leon Schwartz, who was one of the most important klezmer violinists in New York, and just generally a very influential member of the klezmer community in North America in the 20th century. So, as you can see here, Leon played a job at the Young Israel of Sunnyside. This is an Orthodox synagogue in Queens. It's still there today. And I have no idea what kind of event this was because it doesn't say, but most likely either a wedding or a bar mitzvah of someone in that community. He played in late December 1957 and was paid a couple of weeks later in January 1958. So not so bad. And this receipt shows us that this was a union job, which was not at all obvious during this period. A lot of jobs went unreported. We can see that Leon paid his taxes to the union a day after he got his paycheck. You can also see that this was a band with 3 musicians in total, and Leon was the leader, so he got a few extra bucks, and there was no overtime. So the whole thing cost $96.30. And this document just gives us a glimpse into the life of a club date musician in the 1950s. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any recordings of Leon Schwartz from this period, but I do want to give you a taste of who he was and what kind of music he played. So here's a short clip from the 1980s of Leon Schwartz playing fiddle.
Mitzvah Tänzel, a Hasidic Tänzel, you can call it anything you want. That wasn't meant for one special thing. Like for Here Comes the Bride, Here Comes the Bride.
This is a freilich, says that.
Yeah, this is a freilich.
I do kind of love this video. There's an hour-long video of him talking to the camera. Okay, so that was a bit about the lives of club date musicians, but what was the music? What did they actually play at Jewish weddings? These weddings featured a very wide range of traditional and contemporary musical genres coming from both Jewish and non-Jewish origins. The diversity reflected the diversity of American Jews themselves, who had very different musical preferences that were tied with all sorts of factors: religious, cultural, political, and socioeconomic. I'll start with an overview, then I'll zoom in a little bit. So generally speaking, the American Jewish wedding repertoire included 4 categories. The biggest one, kind of like a typical wedding today, was pop, contemporary North American popular music, which basically meant at the time jazz or swing, which could go with any number of dances like Lindy Hop or Jitterbug and many others. And later on, starting in the late 50s, rock and roll came along too. This music was so common and so dominant at weddings that wedding musicians sometimes called it American or even just regular music. The next big group was Latin ballroom dances, which around this time was primarily rumba, merengue, cha-cha, and mambo. There were some others that came later. These dances were becoming popular in the US since at least the mid-40s, and they stayed popular for a few decades. American Jews were very eager to listen and dance to this music because even though it was part of American popular music, essentially, in a sense, it was the exotic other of American pop culture. So consuming it or appropriating it was a way for them to be American, to perform an American identity. It was like a path into the mainstream. So a lot of American Jews took dancing lessons in Latin dances. This was very common in New York and famously in the Catskills, but also, of course, in Detroit. And here are a couple of ads from the papers from this period. Occasionally, weddings or other events would hire 2 bands so that they could feature an entirely separate band of specialist musicians that were hired specifically to play just Latin music. Next on this list of repertoires were the so-called ethnic or continental dances. These were less common, but not rare. They were usually European dances like the Italian tarantella, Viennese waltz, Hungarian czardas, or Polish polkas, mazurkas, and tangos. And these dances weren't a fixed part of the evening, but very often wedding guests would come up to the bandstand and ask for them. So the band had to be ready with at least a couple of tunes in each category. On top of this already pretty crowded lineup, there was obviously one more important category, and that's, of course, Jewish music. In some sense, this was just another ethnic category, one more stylistic departure from the regular American music that added flavor to the party and addressed the special requirements of the clientele for that evening. Usually at most secular Jewish weddings, Jewish music got about the same playing time as any other ethnic genre, which was no more than 5 or 10 minutes. And actually, here is another wonderful ad I found from Detroit for the orchestra of Jack Weiner or Viner that played weddings and bar mitzvahs. And how convenient for me that he explicitly lists almost exactly the 4 repertoires that I just mentioned. You might also notice that his prices start at $45, which is about half what Leon Schwartz was getting in New York at the same time for a small 3-part band. And it kind of makes sense that rates in Detroit were lower than New York, but since I don't have any more details here, I really don't want to make too much out of these numbers. Now, I don't have any full recordings of secular weddings from this period, but I do have this. This is a recording of a live set in the Catskills from 1967, which I received from the trumpet player, Marty Bass, who I'll get back to in a moment. And this is the set list. That's what they played that night. And it's a pretty similar musical profile to a wedding from this period, maybe with a bit more emphasis on Latin music because it's in the Catskills. And you can see this blend I was talking about of American genres and Latin dances and a little bit of continental music and just one set of Jewish dance music. And this was pretty typical, not a lot of Jewish music. On the other hand, Jewish music had a unique status in this list of repertoires. It was an essential, fixed segment of the evening that carried emotional and sometimes religious significance for the families and for their guests, and it was often performed at key moments of the wedding. Now, if this list of repertoires of genres looks like a lot, that's because it is. The wedding repertoire was very diverse. Every every wedding could feature any or all of these genres. And because of the structure of the club date business, musicians had to be very versatile and know at least a few tunes from every genre. I should mention that these categories, these repertoires, have pretty blurry edges, and the musical distinctions between them weren't always so clear. But most of the time, when people spoke about Jewish music, they were referring to fast dance music that would generally go along with Jewish circle dancing, whether the music itself was klezmer or Hasidic music or Israeli folk songs. The proportion between the different repertoires could be very different from one wedding to another, and it depended on a lot of factors. But right now, I'd like to focus on the ratio between Jewish music and everything else, because it can teach us something about the different approaches to Jewish culture and identity during this period. To describe this truly very complicated network of social factors and musical styles, I use a tool that I developed from conversations with the musicians I've interviewed, and especially these two, Marty Bass and the late Pete Sokolov, who described the amount of Jewish music at post-war weddings as a kind of a range or a spectrum, with one end featuring mostly American music and little to no Jewish music, and the other end featuring exclusively Jewish music. And this tool, this spectrum, is very helpful for visualizing the role of Jewish dance music within the wedding repertoire and for mapping out the social and musical landscape of the club date business. This spectrum represents the full range of Jewish wedding music during this period. And we can think of it as a kind of a social musical map, in the sense that every section of the Jewish community takes up a spot or a region on this map, each according to their musical taste and musical needs. Obviously, this map is kind of simplified, but it's a pretty effective way to make sense of this period, and it allows me to show the relationship between a few social factors that shaped the musical landscape. And the social factors that I've studied so far are the level of religiosity, the degree of proximity and attachment to Yiddishkeit, the amount of time that has passed since immigration to America, socioeconomic class, the relationship between generations within the family, and political affiliation. And today, for the sake of time, I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of these, and I'll start with religiosity, which maybe unsurprisingly was the most influential factor that determined the amount of Jewish music at the wedding. So here you can see a very, very basic depiction of religiosity on the spectrum. And in this image, the right-hand side of the spectrum, where Jewish music was more dominant, is occupied by Orthodox weddings, where rabbis and other religious authority figures tried to keep the weddings strictly kosher by keeping non-Jewish music off the dance floor. At Hasidic weddings, there would often be exclusively Jewish music, and usually there would be an emphasis on special tunes that were associated with the particular Hasidic sect that the family belonged to. At other Orthodox weddings that were not Hasidic, there could still be at least some American music, sometimes quite a bit. There were some rabbis that allowed it, and at least in some cases, the band would start with Jewish music, wait for the rabbis to leave, and then switch to American dance music, which usually meant mixed gender social dancing. I'm going to be focusing today more on the secular or less observant side of the spectrum, but here you can see a list of some of the famous names of band leaders that played Orthodox and Hasidic weddings during this period. On the left-hand side of the spectrum were the so-called secular weddings, which is a pretty vague label, and there is still a very wide range of religious customs and behaviors, but relatively speaking, these were less observant Jews. So these secular weddings were the main source of employment for Jewish wedding musicians in the 50s, and they generally featured less Jewish music and more American music. But there was still a lot of diversity because Jewish music could fill anything from a few minutes all the way up to a third or even half of the music in some cases. But usually the bottom end of this range was much more common. And that's why musicians from this generation often called these weddings not secular weddings, but American weddings, because there was so much American music, a lot more than Jewish. There was a direct relationship between the amount of Jewish music and the proximity and level of attachment to Eastern European Jewish culture, or Yiddishkeit. So the further the bridal couple and their families were removed from Yiddishkeit, the less Jewish music would be played at their weddings. Another way of putting it, the more they adapted to mainstream American culture, the more their wedding party was likely to be dominated by swing, rock, and Latin ballroom dances. So let's just look at a couple of factors that shaped this proximity to Yiddishkeit. And one obvious component is the amount of time that had passed since the family immigrated to the United States. The extreme group in this regard were the recent post-war immigrants. Often they were Holocaust survivors who had just arrived from Europe, and they were called in Yiddish die Grine, or the greenhorns. The Grine were contemporaries, but from a different world, and they were more attuned to recent developments in popular music in Europe than in America. So for instance, they had a clear preference for continental dances, like Polish tangos and Viennese waltzes and Russian waltzes, but they also danced to traditional Yiddish music. And so their arrival in the US gave a temporary boost for klezmer and for American klezmer musicians. For instance, there were some band leaders like Murray Lehrer and Marty Levitt who focused on this clientele. And so they had to have ready at their fingertips a pretty wide repertoire of both continental dances and traditional Yiddish music. And we can really see this in the recordings. The most famous example is Marty Levitt's album from 1968, Marty Goes Continental, where the album cover proudly announces that Marty plays, quote, your favorite songs and dances from Vienna, Budapest, Warsaw, Moscow, Tel Aviv, and other capitals of the world, end quote. Murray Lehrer is a bit less known. I don't have his portrait, and I actually don't know that much about him other than that he was an accordionist and that he played quite a bit for this community, the Grine. But he did record a few albums in the 1950s with Dave Tarras, the famous clarinetist. And I want to play you some more music. So here is a distinctly continental example. This track is called Old European Waltz Medley, and it's from an LP with Murray Lehrer and Dave Tarras and some other musicians from around 1958. Let's listen to this. Okay, another interesting factor that influenced the attachment to Yiddishkeit was socioeconomic class. According to the musicians I interviewed, wealth was a pretty strong indicator of the amount of Jewish music at a wedding. For instance, Ray Cohen told me, the poorer they were, the more the Jewish influence was prevalent. The more expensive the wedding, the less authentic or important the Jewish music. A wedding at the Pierre or the Waldorf or the St. Regis, the fancy hotels where mostly for rich Park Avenue Jews to have a really expensive wedding with the finest food, a bigger band, and a budget that allows the best flowers and everything. The most affluent clientele booked what's known as society orchestras, like the bands of Lester Lannon and Peter Duchin. And while there were plenty of Jewish musicians playing in these orchestras, they usually played non-Jewish society events where Jewish music would be practically irrelevant. Occasionally, they did perform at a very wealthy Jewish wedding, and then they would play a short set of Jewish dance music with the most basic common tunes, things like Hava Nagila and Arza Alinu, to give the audience an opportunity to dance a hora. So on the spectrum I was describing before, these bands fit at the very end on the left. Just below the high society in the social hierarchy were upper middle class Jews who booked bands that specialized in American music, like the bands of Lou Ross and Herb Sherry, or certain band leaders from the Stephen Scott office, like Marty White and Cy Mention. One of these band leaders, Marty White, was famous for saying, the more you charge them, the better they think it is, which was probably true. And his bands played primarily American music, with just one short set of Jewish dance music. And for the purposes of his clientele, that was more than enough. Here's how Marty Bass, the trumpet player, described these weddings. He said, a Marty White band is a Jewish job. It's a Jewish job with modern Jewish people that probably they play Hava Nagila and they'd be very satisfied to jump around to a couple of Jewish tunes. And everything else is American. That's a Marty White band. And it just so happens by coincidence that I interviewed someone who hired Marty White's band for their wedding. This was the wedding of Eleanor and Herbert Poznansky, who got married in the Bronx in 1958. For their wedding, Marty brought a 6-piece band, and among the dances they performed, Eleanor mentioned the Lindy Hop, Jitterbug and Twist, also Mambo and Rumba, as well as one waltz for the older generation. And for the Jewish dancing, they played one medley of Israeli folk songs, during which the couple sat in the center while their guests marched around them in a circle. In contrast to these very American weddings, there were also families that put more emphasis on Jewish music. And this also generally corresponded with social class. So for the middle class clientele, there were band leaders like George Paul and Herb Davidson, who played at mid-range catering halls. Most of the dancing was still American music, but they also played slightly more Jewish music than the previous group, with a more elaborate set of Jewish dance music, or even two sets, and occasionally they would also sing some Yiddish songs. So for instance, Marv Kurz, one of these band leaders, even though he was one of the founders of the Stephen Scott office, they usually specialized in American music, he himself was slightly more Yiddish oriented than his colleagues, and he even released a couple of albums of Yiddish music around this time. And I want to play you a quick example just to give you a taste. I'll just mention that musicians who used to work with him, with Marv Kurz, described him as a tumler, a kind of a crossover performer, MC, and comedian. They said that he was very charismatic and entertaining as a band leader, which I think will be pretty obvious from this recording. So this is the famous Israeli song, Tzena Tzena, except that he rewrote the lyrics in Yiddish, and he's performing it as what he calls Tzena Tzena, the Marv Kurz edition or version, which means Tzena Tzena means teeth in Yiddish, and it's actually a song about false teeth that keep getting lost.
Oi, Zähne, 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 Schwein geht und eine Runde Zähne. Oi, was alle kleine, die falsche Zähne. Zähne, Zähne, oi, die falsche Zähne. Ich geh nicht essen, ich geh, oi, wies mit Zähne, Zähne, oi, die falsche Zähne. Ich geh nicht essen, was auch bin, aha, Zähne, Zähne. Schnell geht mit der Zähne,
He's funny. He's a tumler. Okay, so next on the spectrum with even more Jewish music was the lower or lower middle class clientele with band leaders like Max Goldberg and later the Epstein brothers, who were all completely fluent in traditional Yiddish music and klezmer. The weddings they played usually took place in more modest venues, and even though there was probably still a majority of American dances, they required considerably more Jewish music, with 2 or even 3 sets of Jewish dancing that often featured traditional Yiddish dances, like shares, bulgars, and freilichs. One example of this clientele is the wedding of Helen and Herman Gritz, who were married in the Bronx in 1949. I'm very lucky to have some video footage of their wedding, and that's what I'm showing you right now, even though, as far as I can tell, this video doesn't feature any Jewish circle dancing. So Helen Gritz was born in the Bronx, and she described her background as lower middle class Jewish. When she was growing up, she was surrounded by Yiddish language, music, and dance, and she passed them on to her children and grandchildren, some of whom still use Yiddish on a regular basis today. So Helen Gritz told me that her wedding featured different kinds of American dancing. She mentioned swing and Latin dances alongside plenty of Jewish dances like freilichs, bulgars, shares, and horas, with Jewish music taking up about a quarter of the time, which is not a majority, but still a lot more than the previous groups. She also mentioned that the dance floor was very crowded with people from every generation dancing. She and her friends, any children that were present, and everyone from her parents' generation too, men and women, everyone dancing together. And I think that's pretty obvious from this footage that you're seeing. Okay, so putting together all of this information about social class and musical taste and different bands, we get something that looks like this. And keep in mind that we're just looking at the so-called secular or American weddings in this chart. And this shows us with a bit more gradation and detail how social class affected the amount of Jewish music at post-war weddings and which bands filled these different niches of the Jewish club date business. If we zoom out a little bit, this chart shows you a broader overview of the spectrum, including some factors and bands that I didn't have time to discuss today, and it gives you an idea of just how diverse and multifaceted was the social and musical landscape of this scene. As I was preparing for this talk, I came across quite a few bands that played Jewish weddings in Detroit, and you can see a few examples scrolling by here. I don't know where any of these bands would fit on the spectrum. I don't know what kind of music they were playing, who they were playing it for, because I didn't do any interviews in Detroit, and it's very hard to get this information just from textual material. But if you know any of these bands, if you heard them play, if they played at your wedding or your parents' wedding, I'd love to hear about it. So you can tell me in just a few minutes. And now I'd like to transition from this very schematic, very simplified view of wedding music with these charts and all that to discuss what this music actually meant to the people who listened to it. And to understand that, we need to take a step back and look at American Jewish weddings from a broader perspective, because during the first half of the 20th century, these weddings, like a lot of American Jewish culture, changed pretty dramatically. And through this change, Jewish wedding music acquired new meanings and became more important than ever before. To explain this process, I'm going to drop just one academic buzzword here, and that's symbolic ethnicity, which is a term that was coined by the American Jewish sociologist Herbert Gans, who's written a lot about ethnic cultures in America, and in particular about American Jewish culture. So according to Gans, ethnic immigrant cultures go through a process of acculturation. And over time, they lose some of their defining traits and become more like their host societies, in this case, like mainstream American culture. And Gans talks about a particular stage in this process, which he calls symbolic ethnicity, when many of the older cultural and religious practices fade away, and the ones that remain are less concerned with regulating everyday life and more focused on expressing one's ethnic identity and reinforcing a feeling of belonging to a group. These cultural practices and objects are symbolic of this ethnic identity. They symbolize it. That's why he calls it symbolic ethnicity. So for instance, for American Jews, one simple example is the rise of kosher style, which happened just around this period. What you're seeing here are some ads for kosher style catering services from Detroit. We saw one of them earlier because they were advertising right next to the wedding bands. Kosher style refers to food products or services that imitate kosher Jewish cuisine, but don't actually follow the rules of how to prepare or how to consume this food according to halacha, according to Jewish law. And this is a perfect example of symbolic ethnicity because everybody recognized it as symbolic of Jewishness, but it didn't actually follow the rules that used to regulate traditional Jewish life. Okay, so during the early post-war period, secular American Jews were shifting towards symbolic ethnicity, and this included their wedding practices. Many of the traditional customs were pretty much abandoned, like going to the mikveh, the ritual bath, or fasting on the day of the wedding. And many other practices were modified or substituted, like the chuppah, the wedding canopy, the ketubah, the marriage contract, and the wedding rings. There were many families that really modified these practices quite heavily. And Jewish wedding music also shifted towards symbolic ethnicity. But music has a few special characteristics, which I'll explain in a moment, that allowed it to stay uniquely stable and important among Jewish wedding practices. And during the post-war period, when so many wedding rituals had disappeared or changed beyond recognition, Jewish dance music remained an immovable feature of American Jewish weddings. And even though it changed like everything else, there were still surprisingly many continuities with the past. Because of this continuity, music became even more important, and it became one of the primary markers of Jewish identity, especially for secular Jews. And even if there was often very little Jewish music, it could never disappear entirely because it still evoked these strong emotional reactions in American Jews. And the thought of a wedding without any Jewish music at all was nearly unimaginable. Even at the very American end of the spectrum, at a bare minimum, there was at least one set of fast circle dancing with Jewish music, which was usually a medley of 3-4 Jewish tunes. This was sometimes called the Simcha dance, and it often came right after the ceremony, either after the groom breaks the glass or shortly after the couple comes out to the dance floor. On many occasions, the bride and groom were lifted in the air on chairs while the crowd danced or walked around them in circles, clapping to the beat of the music. And if you feel that you can easily see before your eyes an image of the scene that I'm describing right now, that's a testament to just how common and iconic this practice has become. And it's also been represented so many times in films and television, and it shows us how Jewish dance music is so strongly associated with American Jewish weddings. So Jewish wedding music survived the changes of the post-war period, while many other wedding practices did not. But why? Why music? What's so special about it? And to explain this, I want to return for just a moment to the concept of symbolic ethnicity and say that when this shift towards symbolic ethnicity happens, certain cultural practices can become stand-ins for the culture as a whole. So for post-war American Jews, this is precisely what happened with Ashkenazi food and with certain holiday customs and songs and also with Jewish wedding music, which was especially suitable to carry this weight, to become a symbol of Jewishness as a whole. And this happened for several reasons. First of all, the Jewishness of this music was audible and easy to recognize for most post-war American Jews. And I don't mean here that this music is necessarily more Jewish than any other musical tradition. I'm simply saying that for these people in this time and place, this music sounded very clearly Jewish. Secondly, music is a lot simpler and more approachable than many other Jewish customs. It didn't require any sort of specialized knowledge like religious expertise or linguistic fluency, and it didn't require any serious effort or time commitment. It really didn't interfere with everyday secular life, so it was basically accessible to everyone. We should also remember that this was dance music. It's an embodied experience, something that people could connect with through their body and have fun with it. And many of the testimonies that I collected show that indeed everyone enjoyed the dance scene. And like we saw before, and as you can see in this video, there are young people, elders, some children. Everyone wants to join the circle and move their bodies together. So it was an embodied experience. Music also plays a very important role in the maintenance of ethnic identities. There are many, many studies that show that music can perform social functions like reinforcing group identity, marking boundaries between different groups, and preserving collective memories. Weddings were a perfect venue for music to accomplish these tasks because they were big public events with lots of music and dancing where families could perform their Jewish identity publicly in front of their extended family and friends. And finally, music is an art form. It's malleable, it's always evolving, and it's able to articulate several aesthetic agendas simultaneously. So this flexibility and hybridity of the music, in this case of Jewish wedding music, allowed it to adapt to new trends in American Jewish culture while still maintaining meaningful continuities with past musical traditions. And the best example here is the rising popularity of Israeli folk songs in the 50s that blended with klezmer and created a kind of a klezmerized version of Israeli music. Thanks to this aesthetic flexibility, Jewish wedding music was able to symbolize a link to the Jewish past without sounding outmoded or obsolete to its listeners, and so it became such a potent symbol of the continuity of Jewish culture. And because it was a secular symbol of continuity, it was especially important for the less observant American Jews who stepped away from the religious aspects of Judaism, but still really valued the secular symbols like music, dance, food, or sometimes the Yiddish language. For many of them, these secular Jewish symbols, including Jewish wedding music, were the foundations of their Jewish identity. It was an essential part of their wedding celebration, marked the wedding as Jewish, whether it took up half of the party or just one dance set, it didn't matter. And in many of my interviews, when I asked people about the importance of featuring this music at their weddings, they explained it in terms of their Jewish identity and the role that Jewish music played in their upbringing and in their everyday lives. So for instance, Ethel and Yankel Steinberg got married in 1948 in a wedding hall called the Paradine Manor in the Bronx. They had a wedding band that was led by none other than Dave Taras, the famous clarinet player, who played plenty of traditional Yiddish music at their wedding. Ethel told me that it was important to have Jewish music at our wedding because, quote, both my husband and I had a Yiddish background. It was just part of our lives, end quote. Or Rose Spivak, who was born in Brooklyn, and as a child, she was educated in Yiddish at the Arbeitering, the worker circle. Rose got married in New York in 1948, and her wedding band was led by the trumpet player Harry Kutcher of the famous Kutcher family of klezmorim, and she even held on to his business card for more than 70 years, which made me especially happy. Rose described the music at her wedding, and she told me that there was basically an even split between Jewish and non-Jewish dances, which is a lot for this period. When I asked her how she felt about featuring Jewish music at her wedding, she told me, plain and simple, I loved it. I'm Yiddish to the core. And finally, I returned to Helen Gritz. And when I asked her about the importance of Jewish music at our wedding, this is what she said. Jewish music was very much a part of my life. This was as natural to me as breathing to have this kind of music at my wedding. There wasn't anything that I had to think about. It was. So to recap, Jewish wedding music persisted through the post-war era, despite tremendous changes to professional structures, wedding practices, and musical repertoires. This was a very partial continuity. It's important to remember that, but it was a meaningful connection to past Jewish traditions. American Jews, and today I was focusing especially on less observant Jews, they consider this music as one of the primary ways to mark their wedding as Jewish and to express their own Jewish cultural identity. Even when they left other rituals behind, they continued to celebrate with Jewish music and dance. And that makes perfect sense, because hiring a band to perform Jewish music and dancing a hora is a lot simpler, and it aligns much more smoothly with their secular lifestyle than going to the mikveh or getting kosher catering. And it's still a straightforward way to demonstrate their connection to Jewishness in front of all of their friends and relatives. Of course, there were other wedding customs that endured, and some of them were an even stronger demonstration of Jewish tradition, like the wedding ceremony itself and the rabbi and the cantor. But the fact that the music was secular and flexible and so accessible to everyone meant that for non-Orthodox Jews, it became a powerful and effective symbol of Jewish ethnic identity. And it secured its place in American Jewish weddings for generations to come. So thank you all very much for listening. I want to thank these people and institutions for helping me with this project in very many ways. And before I finish, I just want to say that this research is still an ongoing project. And as you can tell, I've learned a lot of this from research interviews. So my email is on the screen right now. And if you or if anyone you know had a Jewish wedding, specifically in the New York area, because that's where my research is focused, around the 1950s, I would really love to speak with you. So please feel free to reach out. That's my email. So thank you once again, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm thrilled. It was just so informative and so much fun to listen to all these things. And what a happy topic. You know, there's so many negative things that you end up coming across in the world. And what a wonderful, wonderful topic. So that kind of leads me to the first question. We are going to open it up for some people to share with you, because I know that's one of the things we talked about, is how much you love to be able to interact with people and people to be able to share a little bit and ask some questions as we go. And we already experienced that a little bit at the very beginning before we started recording. But my first question for you is, how on earth did you stumble across this as a topic? Because it is so much more in depth and has so much more richness than I ever anticipated. I mean, I knew it was going to be a good program, don't get me wrong, because we had talked, but it's amazing how much of an impact I never would have ever thought of it. So how on earth did you come across this as a focus for some research?
Well, first of all, thank you for these glowing compliments. I'm blushing. That's very kind and very great to hear. It was a long process. I didn't start out looking for this. Really, what happened was, it's a much longer story I'm not going to get into, but somehow I fell in love with klezmer, basically, and with Yiddish music pretty late in life. So about 4 or 5 years ago, it was during my PhD. It was already when I was starting my PhD in musicology and moving. I'm originally from Tel Aviv, but I moved to the United States, to Boston. And when I was there, I came across klezmer and sort of rediscovered it through a very different lens from everything I was used to before that. And klezmer is essentially wedding music. Historically, it is wedding music. And many people, well, not many people, but some people who I admire very much have written about the history of klezmer, like Mark Slobin, Zev Feldman, Joel Rubin, Henk Snetsky. There's great work out there. But this period that I'm looking at, the early post-war period, the 1950s, is generally considered the low point in the history of klezmer and of Yiddish culture more generally, because klezmer is part of Yiddish culture, of Eastern European Jewish culture. And it's kind of a time when American Jews were moving away from it, as I was showing, kind of acculturating to mainstream American culture. In Israel, there was a whole different problem with Yiddish and Yiddish culture and Yiddish music that I'm not going to get into right now. It's a very long story. And of course, after the Holocaust, the communities that were the originators of this music were essentially no longer there. So the music was kind of not exactly disappearing, but it was not as prominent as it used to be. It wasn't front stage. In the 1970s, late 70s, there was what we today call sometimes the klezmer revival, even though we scholars don't always like that term. But there was like a good 30 years at least when this music was really not being played as much, even though all of these musicians that were around, except for a couple who, were no longer there, but most of the musicians that had been around in the 20s and the 30s were still active, still playing, Some of them were still recording, and it's wonderful that we have the recordings. So there was still a scene out there. It just wasn't what it used to be. It didn't have the same kind of popularity. So I became really interested in studying, well, what happens when this cultural shift happens? Why is it happening? And I really got interested in this story. A lot of it has to do with the rise of Israeli culture. I have a whole other segment of my work, a whole other chapter of my dissertation that's exclusively about that. Of course, there's a lot to do with Jews turning towards American popular music. That's an even bigger story than Israeli music in some sense. And I'll just say the other component of this that brings me to this story is that I used to be a traditional historical musicologist who sits in an archive or a library with documents and analyzes scores and whatever, and recordings, I guess. And then through this project, because I was working on a slightly later period, I mean, it's still a long time ago, but the 1950s, a lot of these people are still around. And I just started doing some interviews, and I really fell in love with this type of work, this type of historical work that's also ethnographic, that involves speaking with people, interviewing them, becoming, a part of their lives for just a moment and really interacting with them personally. And really that's the thing that led me to most of what you saw today. Like all this thing about the lives of musicians and the meaning that this music had for people who were getting married. I did not set out to find these answers. I had a bunch of questions. After about interview number 5 or 10 or 15, I don't know, my questions gradually shaped into asking about these things because I realized this is where it's at. This is what's really important and interesting here. But I don't think I've barely seen anybody write about the exchange floor, the local 802 Musicians Union exchange floor on 52nd Street, but it's such an important place and so fascinating. And I've heard so many mythical stories about it from musicians who went there. Actually, last time I gave this talk, I got emails from 3 different people who told me that their fathers took them there as little children, and they were at this hall with the smoke and saw all these musicians. It's an amazing place, but I only found out about it through this ethnographic work. Okay, I'm talking a lot.
No, I love it. And as some of you may or may not know, I myself am actually a trained musician. So of course, I find this so fascinating because we only really hear about the interpersonal connections between a performer and their client, if you will, in these exchanges, like especially for those performers that are performing for those simchas. We don't, it's either sort of that background music that nobody's sort of paying attention to, or it's playing this very integral role. And it's amazing to me that you were able to speak to these people, and that film footage that you had, that was so cool. And then to be able to speak to the bride. I mean, how amazing 70 years later, you could have a conversation with her. So I know we're not a gigantic group this evening because unfortunately there were a lot of people that registered that are going to watch the video. They're going to miss out on a personal exchange, but I thought we would open up the floor. There's not a ton of us. So if you have a question and you want to kind of raise your hand, I'll call on you and you are happily to ask any question. We also have some comments in the chat. People are thanking you if you haven't seen it already. So interesting. This was great. Wonderful presentation. They loved every second. So I'm not the only one that's glowing about how wonderful your presentation was. So others are very much enjoying it. So I'd love to open it up. If someone has some questions or a quick comment that they would like to present, please by all means just kind of give me a wave, and I have my screen so I can see everybody, and I am happy to call on some people. I know I have some fellow musicians on here, so feel free to ask away. Yes, Betsy, go for it.
So tell me about what instrument you play.
I'm a vocalist. So Uri and I would be perfect. You can be a pianist and I'll be a vocalist. It'll be great. And I have to say, I absolutely adored that rewriting. My Yiddish is minuscule at best, but the fact that he can't eat, and what was the second part? He can't what? He said he couldn't eat and he couldn't do something in the text for Tanza Tanza. What did he say?
Okay, that was hysterical. Oh,
Tsena, yeah.
Yes, Sena, sorry.
You got something you lose the teeth and you got to take them out when you eat, but then you lose them and you can't find them, something like that. Yeah.
I loved it. All right, Elaine, you raise your hand in the chat, so you'll go first, and then Susie will be next. And you just have to unmute, Elaine. I think you're still muted.
Okay. Hello. Yes, I had read your article in the foreword, and there is nothing like going to a Jewish wedding and hearing the old music. My uncle, his name was Leo Schlossberg, and I remember growing up, he played in a band. And I think I have a vintage photo of him, and it must have been the 40s and 50s and 60s, because he sang Fiddler on the Roof at my wedding in 67. But I remember it being in Detroit, there were people that I knew that were musicians, and that's how they made extra money at night. And it was pretty amazing. And just what they did in New York, it's phenomenal.
Yeah. Thank you for that comment. I'll also just add that many of the musicians that I've spoken with, some of the really prominent musicians of the scene, some people were full-time musicians, but a lot of them were actually, they had day jobs. So for instance, Marty Bass, this trumpet player that I interviewed, he was, I think for about 35 years, a music teacher in a high school.
Mhm.
Working however many days a week, and then grabbing these gigs after work over the weekend. He told me that sometimes he would even have, if he had a window in the middle of a school day, he would get on the subway, go down to Brooklyn or up to the Bronx or wherever, play a job, come back, teach the next term. Ray Musiker, also a very important musician, told me a similar, I don't know about going in the middle of the day, but he also, a lot of them were teachers. He was a music teacher for many, many years. And it's interesting how these people made a living. It is, of course, they also loved the music. They also liked to play. It wasn't just a thing that they were doing to make it happen. But yeah, it was a complicated life. I'll also just mention, this is kind of in response to something that Hillary said before about some people think of this as background music. I found it interesting that when I started this project, some of the people I was most eager to speak with were not so eager to speak with me, and not, they didn't know me. It wasn't personal, but they just, like I said, they were playing music at a period when this music was not greatly appreciated. It was seen as background music. In some cases, it's still seen that way today. And, in some cases, it really is. And I guess that's fine. But they were just kind of in disbelief that a scholar would actually take an interest in their lives and their experiences and the music that they played. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I'm genuinely curious about this, but there were a few people that I had to hound for a few months. Eventually we became very close, and we ended up having a lot of conversations about this. And they saw my work and they gave me comments on my work, and it's like a really positive relationship. But it's true that for a couple of generations, this music just did not have this kind of standing where they would think that somebody would actually want to write about this. Yeah.
What a beautiful gift that you gave those musicians, because a lot of them, I've worked in those gigs, right? We all have, where you go and you're singing or you're doing whatever, and no one's paying attention to you, and you're basically doing it for your fellow musicians' enjoyment. You're the only one listening to each other. So to be able to give them this gift, that this had meaning and this has had an impact, is wonderful and amazing. All right, Susie, you've had your hand up. Please go right ahead.
I was a public school music teacher, and I knew many others who doubled as band leaders. The Apticars from Fenby Carr, I think many of you will remember the Fenby Carr Orchestra. He was a music teacher also, and that was a way for them to subsidize their very meager pay in those days. And but I have to say that I have gone to weddings of all social statuses up until this day. I've never gone to a Jewish wedding in Detroit that didn't have Jewish, where they didn't do a hora and they didn't try to do a share. Of course, half the time nobody knew the real steps, and some old timer had to tell them who does the do-si-do and who does this. But they still do it no matter what social level they're at. They still put in some Jewish music. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just say, like I said, having no Jewish music at all was extremely rare across all social status. It's kind of a matter of how much of it do you have, and also sometimes what kind of Jewish music do you have. So this situation where, for instance, the bride, I don't know if you were here at the beginning, I think you were, where the bride asks for no Jewish music at all, that comes from, I don't know this family. I didn't get to speak with her.
That's bizarre.
It's understandable, because for a lot of people, this music, not just this music, this whole culture had some sort of baggage. I mean, it has to do with baggage of the early post-war period, of fear of anti-Semitism, fear of McCarthyism, of attempts to become more fully assimilated, at least on a cultural level, if not through other aspects, and being rejected. So there's a complicated history there, and I'm not dismissing that. And especially, you know, I think that story is like kind of funny, but also kind of sad. Like, it was really important for her, and they dismissed her wishes. For me, it's one of the best anecdotes I've heard, but I'm always have kind of mixed feelings about it. But yeah, for the most part, the sort of high society Jewish weddings that would hire someone, like I mentioned, some of these society orchestras, which are very big names. Even today, a lot of people would know the orchestra of Lester Lannon, or Peter Duchin is still around in his 80s. I don't know if he plays anymore. And, you know, they would kind of do whatever, some sort of Jewish tune that they could find in a fake book, or that they just knew because everyone knows Hava Nagila, but they wouldn't put a lot of effort into it. And the weddings where it would be more of a centerpiece, where somebody would actually care about it, where they would have, say, 2 or 3 sets of Jewish dance music, and that music would not just be the most common items that everybody knows, that everyone just like immediately thinks of as a stereotype of this music. That tended to be a little bit lower class. And I didn't get to say this today because I was kind of like trying to cut short to make it in time, but all these different social factors that I mentioned there, which some of them I just named and didn't talk about at all, sometimes they were operating against each other. It's not like everything was pulling in the same direction. So you could have, for instance, last week, I had a conversation with someone who was actually from an Orthodox family, but kind of higher social class, and they had no Jewish music at their wedding at all. And this is maybe only the second time that someone has ever told me that about their own wedding. It's very, very rare that this happens. But for whatever reason, they didn't see it as necessary. It wasn't part of what they wanted to do. So, you know, these different social factors, class, political affiliation, religiosity, et cetera, et cetera. I had like a list of 6 of them there. They could be pulling in different directions. And for it to come to a situation where there is absolutely no Jewish music in the mid-50s, that's pretty rare. Yeah, Susie, I see your hand up.
Again, one more time. I think in my high school, Mumford High School yearbook, 1957, so you know how old I am, there were advertisements for Joe Cornell and for bands, because it was so important that everybody learned how to dance. Dancing was really important. Everybody took lessons in those days, in the 50s. It was something you had to know how to do. And the floors were always crowded at these weddings.
Yeah, I saw a lot of ads for dance lessons. I showed you a couple earlier, but there's just a selection of like a million of them that I saw. Also, so many ads for bands. I tried to like clip all the names that I saw just so that I can give you a bit of a list of bands in Detroit. I don't know if anybody recognized any of the names of the bands that I put there.
I think
Okay,
Betsy has her hand up. I think she might have recognized 1 or 2 of them.
Well, actually, I did not recognize those names, but I recognized when Elaine Gross said Milt Aptekar, because Milt Aptekar was a very dear friend of my Uncle Sam Barnett.
Yeah.
And so who was you know Sam? Who was your
My uncle was Leo Schlossberg.
Leo Schlossberg. So those guys all knew each other.
Right.
And they would pick up whoever was available, right? And Uncle Sammy used to teach. He started his teaching career at Hutchins. Later, he moved, I think it was Chadsey. He was head of the music departments in both the Chadsey High School. And nighttime was a whole different world. And Auntie and Uncle Sammy never, as you'll know, Susie, and you'll know, Elaine, they didn't have New Year's Eve. It was always another time that they celebrated because they couldn't have their own parties then.
You make big money on those nights. What are you talking about?
That's absolutely right. You couldn't pass that up.
Exactly.
The other thing, now I don't want to lose my train of thought, was that I don't think that some of those guys really needed to advertise. Uncle Sammy played Orthodox weddings. Uncle Sammy had, and I'm sure that Schlossberg, and Aptekar did too. And there are several other names that I can't pull up right now, but they were, you know, in a family. We knew everybody's names, but that they almost didn't have to, because they just were referred. Everybody knew them. I want to share one funny story, then I'll be quiet. So Uncle Sammy had a very long, decades-long career. And he would frequently be greeted at a wedding or at a bar mitzvah and say, "Oh, your father did my bar mitzvah." Well, Grandpa David was a bricklayer, but Uncle Sammy was there for so many decades that people didn't realize that he was still there. And the wonderful thing about musicians is how they stay young.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, I want to thank everyone, and especially Uri, for presenting this evening. I know I thoroughly enjoyed it. I especially enjoyed it because I just got back from vacation, and when I was on vacation, my boyfriend asked me to marry him. So this is even more appropriate because we're going to be planning a wedding, and now I have some help, and I even made him come this evening. The Jeff on there is my Jeff. So we will be planning some things, and now I can have an idea of the ratio I should be having for our music at our wedding. So thank you so much. It's probably why
And
I'm
a
so
good
enthusiastic.
A good too,
Better
muzzle.
book your band right away.
Thank
Mazel
you.
tov.
Yes, yes. Book the band before you book anything else. That's the rule.
Mhm.
Well, thank you all so very, very much for participating this evening. Thank you, Uri, for
Sure.
joining us. This was absolutely delightful. And I look forward to seeing all of you at a future program. Thank you all so much. Have a beautiful evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye
Thank
for
you.
now.
Thank you, and
Bye-bye.
thanks for coming.